Last summer in July, I started going on night walks. It was a healthy way to keep my mind off of the negative things in my life. I'm a recently widowed mother, and I live with my daughter in a small house on a pretty quiet street. Ever since my husband passed, I became an alcoholic and have been trying to get sober ever since. I found night walks to be a way to free my mind and get a clear head so that I could be a better mom for my daughter. One night, after I tucked my daughter into bed, I went out for my routine walk. I'd walk a mile or so down the road, passing a few houses, to a parking lot of an old rustic church no longer used by any congregation at the end of the road. I made my routine trip, walking down the street and circling around the parking lot to then walk back home at the church, which is the halfway point to my house. When I was about a third of the way back home, I heard something in the forest I haven't heard before. It sounded like a distant voice, faintly echoing through the trees, though I couldn't hear it very clearly. My skin chilled and my breath halted. I was soon able to make out the noise I kept hearing. It was a woman's voice, maybe some 100 feet or so back into the woods, crying, sobbing. Her voice was strained, and it sounded like she was in agonizing pain. Immediately, dozens of scenarios played out in my mind, each one more terrible than the last. I could hear a distant voice of what sounded like a man in the woods near the area of the screaming. Despite being defenseless and terrified, I slowly crept into the woods to try and get a little closer to the noise. It was pitch black, but after walking 70 feet or so, I could hear the voices, only this time, much easier. I could hear the man's voice yelling as he attacked and beat the woman, but I still couldn't see anything. I took another dreaded step closer, and that's when my foot landed on a stick, making a loud snapping sound. The man went silent, and the woman screamed out for help as loud as possible. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, as I stood there frozen in fear, trying not to make the slightest sound. That's when my fight or flight instincts really kicked in, and I knew I had to get out. I had no chance of overpowering whoever the man was in the darkness just feet in front of me. I convinced myself I had to run, and run fast, as I thought about my daughter at home, sound asleep. It took every ounce of courage in me, but I turned around and sprinted towards the road as fast as possible. It could have just been my imagination, but I could have sworn that I'd heard footsteps behind me as I sprinted as fast as I ever have. Despite falling a few times and scratching myself against tree branches, I made it to the road where I could already see the lights to my house. I continued sprinting, completely terrified, and ran up to the front door, horrified to look back, not knowing if I was being followed. As soon as I got inside, I slammed the door shut and reached for my phone to call 911. I told them there was a woman being attacked in the woods near my home. They eventually arrived at my door, and I explained what happened. Despite their suspicions of me being involved with it, which I don't blame them considering that I've made terrible choices drunk, they finally went out into the woods to search for the woman. A couple hours went by, and I eventually passed out on the couch out of pure exhaustion. The next morning at 6 a.m., I woke up to the dreaded sound of my alarm clock, knowing I had to get up and go to work. I made breakfast for myself and my daughter, and we got in the car so I could drop her off at school, then head to work. On the way, I approached several police cars parked by the side of the road. My heart sunk as I neared them. I had my windows down, and came to a stop as an officer waved me to pass through. I had a really bad feeling in my stomach that something terrible had happened, but I kept driving since I was with my daughter and I didn't want her to hear anything. The next day after work, I learned what happened when I was watching the news. It made the headline story for my local news station. A body had been found in the woods. The body of a young woman. I immediately began to tear up as I watched the segment of the horrifying details of the murder. I felt so much regret as I watched the interviewed family grieve and mourn the loss of their daughter. If only I had taken a few steps further into the woods, I could have possibly helped her and prevented her death. It still haunts me to this day, but I'm glad I'm still here for my daughter at least. I lived with my mother and father, who would often have terrible fights over financial issues and a bunch of other stuff I'd rather not get into. I would try to get out of the house as much as possible to avoid the constant arguments. One night, my friends were dropping me off back home after hanging out on a late Friday night in the fall. As soon as I got out of the car, I could already hear the violent shouting and yelling coming from inside my house. I let out a sigh of annoyance, thinking to myself, here we go again, as I opened a screen door on the side of the house. Within seconds of walking inside, I could smell the overly strong scent of alcohol coming from the living room, where I saw my dad yelling at my mom with a bunch of empty beer cans next to him on the floor. It wasn't often that my dad would drink, but when he did, he would always instigate a fight, whether it was with me or my mom. I instantly started getting harassed and yelled at when he said I was home late, even though we agreed on 1 a.m. just a few hours ago. We ended up getting into an argument about it, so I walked out and went for a walk to cool myself down. My neighborhood is usually pretty quiet. We live in the suburbs in a middle class area, so there aren't many issues with crime. I turned left out of my house and began walking down the street on the sidewalk, upset at my dad because of how he was treating me and my mother. I continued walking, quickly becoming cold, realizing that I had left my jacket at home, but that was the last thing to cross my mind in the heat of the moment when I just wanted to get out of the house. As I approached the end of the street, I noticed an all-black car parked on the side of the road with its lights on. It didn't really strike my attention as something suspicious, and I continued on. As I approached the stop sign, I made a right and crossed the street in front of the parked car. After walking for maybe another 5 minutes or so, I thought I heard a car engine slowly idling behind me. I turned around and saw the same black car that was parked on the side of the road, maybe 20 feet behind me. This time, the lights were shut off. It was nerve-wracking seeing this, so I reached for my phone in my pocket to realize that I also left it back at home in my jacket, completely forgetting it since I was so upset. Now being pretty concerned, I picked up my walking pace without making it look like I was running. As I did this, I heard the low humming of the car engine become slightly louder as I kept walking. My heart started beating faster, knowing I was in danger. I was only about halfway around the block, so I thought of my options. I thought about cutting through the yards to shorten the distance home, but every house I looked at was completely fenced in and I'd have to climb the fences, which could slow me down if the person in the car chased me. I thought about running up to someone's house and ringing the doorbell, but I'd run the risk of basically cornering myself from the person. It seemed like my only viable option was to run the remainder of my walk and lock myself inside my house once I got back. I kept hearing the car, which kept getting closer and louder, so I decided it was my only option, and I started running as fast as I possibly could. Just as I did this, I heard the engine behind me rev up and continue to follow me just a few feet behind, still without any lights on. I was terrified. I didn't know who this person was, or what they wanted, but I didn't want to find out. Maybe about 3/4 of the way around the block, the car sped up and matched my speed, now driving right next to me. I looked over my shoulder to try to see who it was, but they were wearing a ski mask over their head. Out of sheer panic, I cut to the right and ran directly towards the house and started pounding on their door. I turned around to see that the car was now parked right in front of the house, and the person was now standing right outside the car staring at me. I waited maybe 30 seconds, but there was no answer. Once the person realized nobody was coming to the door, they started walking directly towards me. What really freaked me out was how leisurely this person was approaching me. I yelled, telling the person to go away, but they continued walking towards me in the same manner. At this point, the adrenaline took over, realizing I was in serious danger. I sprinted around the side of the house to a wooden fence and tried to climb it. It was about 6.5 feet tall, and there was no way I could grip it. I looked over my shoulder behind me to see that the person was now running towards me. I screamed, not knowing what else to do. By some miracle, I was able to scale the fence just before the stranger caught up to me. I was able to get over the other side of the fence by boosting myself up and over by stepping on a wheelbarrow and sprinted directly towards my house. I finally made it to my street, and I just had to cross the road and make it past a few more houses until I was home. At almost the exact same time I started to cross the street, I heard the engine that was distant become louder and closer. I turned to look as I saw the car flying down the road directly towards me. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life to my house. Just as I ran up my driveway, the car stopped right outside. I opened the screen door, locking it as I looked to see that the person was walking up my driveway. I screamed to my parents that someone was following me, and they got up and looked at the window to see the man who was now standing at the front door. My dad screamed to go away or he'd call the cops. The person just stood there for a minute, not saying a word, completely emotionless. I sat there, terrified, as I peered through the blinds on the window. Finally, the person turned around and slowly walked back to the car and drove away. I was never able to get the license plates of the car, and still don't know who that person was, or what they wanted to this day. This has to be one of the most bizarre and terrifying encounters in my life. I needed to take my car to the shop to get work done. It was an old beater that I was planning on getting rid of soon, once I had the money. I was supposed to drop it off during the day, but I got held up at work, preventing me from doing so. I called the mechanic around 4:45, which was 15 minutes before they closed, letting him know that I was held up and wouldn't be able to get the car in before 5. He was very understanding of my situation and told me that I could leave my car overnight if I dropped it off and left the keys in the drop box, or I could just come by tomorrow to drop it off when they were open. I was thankful to hear about the drop box, and I told them I'd swing by to drop it off sometime later that night since my car was in desperate need of work. Once I got home, I grabbed a bite to eat and watched a little bit of TV before leaving. I didn't want to bother anybody by asking for a ride home so late at night, so I decided I'd walk home. It was only about 5 miles or so, plus I was trying to lose weight and could use the exercise. On a whim, I decided I'd bring my 30-pound terrier mix with me, who had literally never barked once the entire 8 months I've had him, and was potentially one of the friendliest dogs in the world. We arrived at the shop, dropping off the car, preparing for the walk home. I started walking the first 10 or 15 minutes, realizing that this would take a lot longer than I expected, so I decided to start jogging. I was running down an old, dark town street in the city when my dog suddenly whirled around a large lilac bush next to us and started barking like he was possessed. He sounded like a hellhound, at least 5 times bigger than he actually was. I backed away from the bush while my dog strained at the leash, looking like he was about to murder someone. I couldn't figure out what he was barking at, and I tried pulling him away, but he was acting in a way I'd never seen before. As I was trying to get him away, a guy popped out of the bush and I yelled that I'd let the dog off the leash if he didn't get away from me. It was so dark he couldn't really see my tiny dog, who sounded ferocious, and he started jogging down the road the opposite way, looking back every once in a while. I could see as he crossed under a streetlight that he was wearing jeans with unlaced work boots and some sort of ski hat with a medical mask covering his face, which was strange considering it was the middle of summer. He yelled that he was a runner just like me, but I knew he was obviously lying. We continued on with our run for another 20 minutes or so until the exact same thing happened again. My dog started barking at another bush like crazy until a different man popped out. Only this time, the man charged out of the bush and attacked me, beating me pretty badly. Just like the first man, I noticed he was wearing a winter hat and had a medical mask across his face. Thankfully, my dog full out attacked the man, biting at his legs as he sat on top of me. Apparently his bite was enough to make him surrender, as he got up and ran away down the road. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I ran to a lit house, called the cops, and waited on the front porch as the homeowner stood with me and my dog. They told me there had been a dozen reports of gang-related muggings within a 10-block radius in the past week. The cop was kind enough to give my dog and I a ride home. My dog got a lot of extra treats that night, considering he saved me not just once, but twice, from 2 different people.